Hello NDE narrator, my name is Jaroudi, a former Navy SEAL. I am 51 years old and I was born in Beirut, Lebanon. I grew up in a small apartment near the southern suburbs of the city, in a neighborhood that still carried the scars of past conflicts. My father was a retired schoolteacher, and my mother worked at a small textile shop near the market. Life wasn't easy, but it was filled with warmth. We were practicing Muslims, and Islam shaped our daily lives. Our prayers, our meals, our conversations. I was the middle child of 5, and from an early age, I was known to be both quiet and observant. I would sit near the window every night, watching the lights from the mosques flicker as the call to prayer echoed across the rooftops. I loved my city, my people, and my faith, and I believed with all my heart that I belonged to a culture rich in honor, dignity, and resilience. When I turned 16, my uncle in Detroit sponsored our family's migration to the United States. He had been living in Michigan for over 15 years and had finally managed to help us secure our visas. I remember the day we boarded the plane from Rafik Hariri International Airport like it was yesterday. I had never been on a plane before. I clutched a small Quran my grandmother gave me and looked out of the window, unsure of what was waiting for us on the other side. We landed in Detroit in the middle of winter. Snow was falling and the air bit through my jacket. Everything looked so different. The roads were wide, the cars were bigger, and people barely made eye contact. It was a complete cultural shock. But for my parents, this was a dream, an opportunity to give us a better life. They enrolled me in high school quickly, and that was where my second life truly began. As I tried to settle into American society, I found myself caught between two worlds. At home, we still spoke Arabic. We prayed 5 times a day. We celebrated Eid. But outside, I was just another brown kid with a thick accent trying to navigate locker rooms and lunch tables. Some days, I'd hear people call me a terrorist under their breath. Other days, teachers would mispronounce my name or skip it altogether during roll call. I started to feel invisible but also angry. It was hard to make friends. I dressed differently, I smelled like the food we cooked at home, and I didn't understand the jokes they laughed at. So I kept to myself. But deep down, I wanted to belong. I wanted to prove that I wasn't a threat, that I was just as American as anyone else. And yet, I couldn't give up my roots. I was a proud Arab. I loved my faith. I couldn't turn my back on who I was. By the time I finished high school, I was restless. I didn't want to work at a gas station or in a warehouse like some of the other Arab boys I knew. I wanted something bigger, something that would show everyone that I was loyal, trustworthy, and strong. The September 11th attacks happened when I was just starting my senior year, and the world turned upside down for Muslims in America. I remember walking down the hallway and everyone was staring at me like I had something to do with it. That day changed everything. I knew I had to do something to defend the image of people like me, and that was when I decided to join the military. At first, my parents were horrified. They begged me not to enlist, but I had made up my mind. I walked into a recruitment office 2 weeks after graduation and told the officer I wanted to join the Navy. Not just the Navy, I wanted to become a SEAL. Becoming a Navy SEAL was the hardest thing I've ever done. The training was brutal. They break you down physically, mentally, emotionally. I was one of only a handful of Muslim recruits and I felt the pressure every day. I wasn't just proving something to my instructors. I was proving something to myself, to my country, to my community back home. There were nights during Hell Week when I thought I was going to die. We ran for miles in the freezing surf. We carried boats over our heads until our shoulders went numb. We were pushed to the edge again and again. But I didn't quit. Every time I thought of giving up, I remembered the humiliation I felt in high school. I remembered the dirty looks, the suspicion. I kept telling myself, this is how I earn my place. And after months of grueling pain, I passed. I became a Navy SEAL. When I finally got deployed, everything became real. My first mission was in the Horn of Africa. I was 24. I still remember stepping off the aircraft with my gear strapped to my back, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We were trained for everything: combat, hostage rescue, intel gathering. I worked with some of the most disciplined men I've ever known. They didn't care where I came from, not once we were on the field. We became brothers, bound by sweat, fear, and survival. In the SEALs, you watch each other's backs no matter what. We weren't fighting for politics. We were fighting for each other. That kind of bond changes you. It makes you loyal in ways most people can't understand. You take a bullet for your team without hesitation. That was the kind of family I had found. The family I was ready to die for. My deployments took me to some of the most hostile environments in the world: Somalia, Iraq, parts of Pakistan. But the most defining mission came when I was sent to Afghanistan. That was the first time I truly understood what war does to a man's soul. We were operating in the mountains near Kunar province, and tensions were always high. Every village felt like a trap, every shadow a possible threat. There were nights we slept with one eye open. I lost friends. I saw things that still haunt me to this day. But I held on to my discipline. I did what I was trained to do. I followed orders. I was proud to wear the uniform, proud to be a Muslim Arab serving a country that gave my family a second chance. I thought I was finally accepted, that I had done enough to prove myself. Loyalty meant everything to me. When I put on that uniform, I wasn't just an immigrant, I was an American. I saluted the flag with the same hand I raised to make du'a. I didn't see a conflict in that. In fact, I saw honor. My religion taught me about justice, about sacrifice, about protecting the innocent. And in my own way, I believed that's what I was doing. I never once saw my work in the SEALs as betrayal to my people or my faith. I believed Allah had given me strength, and I used that strength in service. I held on to my convictions even when things got tough. But deep inside, I started to feel something shifting. I didn't know it yet, but a storm was forming. A storm that would later shake everything I believed in and bring me to the edge of destruction. Our final mission in Afghanistan came without warning. We had been stationed in Kunar province for nearly 6 weeks, conducting surveillance and assisting in joint operations with Afghan forces. The air was thin in those mountains and every movement felt heavier. Intelligence suggested an enemy stronghold in a cluster of abandoned homes just outside a remote village. My unit was tasked with approaching the location before dawn, clearing the structure and securing any intel. It was supposed to be a routine sweep, something we had done dozens of times. We moved in silence through the narrow footpaths, the only sounds being our boots and the crunch of gravel. I took the lead position with my squad behind me. As we reached the perimeter of the target building, everything looked quiet, too quiet. I signaled the team to spread out. Then, in a flash, the entire front wall of the building exploded. The explosion was sudden and massive. We had walked straight into a trap, an IED rigged under the foundation, likely triggered by a pressure plate or remote device. The blast threw me backward like a rag doll. I remember the sound leaving my ears like being pulled underwater, and then I hit the ground hard, everything spinning. My helmet cracked. Blood filled my mouth. I couldn't feel my legs. I saw one of my teammates lying motionless nearby, and 2 others screaming, trying to crawl to safety. Dust and smoke covered everything. I tried to lift my rifle, but my arm wouldn't respond. My left side was numb. My vest had protected my core, but my limbs were torn and shrapnel had pierced my thigh and shoulder. My vision blurred. I whispered the Shahida, thinking that this was my end. But just before I blacked out, I saw 2 of my brothers pulling me to cover as gunfire erupted from the tree line. I woke up 3 days later at a military hospital inside Bagram Air Base. My body felt like it had been hit by a truck. Tubes were everywhere. My leg was heavily bandaged and my arm was immobilized. A nurse told me I had lost a lot of blood and nearly died. The explosion had broken my femur and fractured my collarbone. Shrapnel had caused deep muscle damage. My hearing on the left side was partially gone. I lay in that bed for weeks, mostly silent. Visitors came and went, but the worst part was the silence in my own mind. I kept asking myself if I had missed something. Had I not cleared properly? Was this my fault? When my commanding officer came to see me, he offered a tight smile, said I had done well and told me to rest. I wanted to believe him, but something in his eyes said otherwise. I started to feel like I was just another broken soldier. Eventually, I was flown back to the United States and admitted to the Naval Medical Center in San Diego. The doctors were kind, but their words were rehearsed. They told me recovery would take time. That was fine. I wasn't in a rush. But within a few weeks, the tone changed. Evaluators came in. Therapists. Then a higher-ranking officer informed me that my injuries would prevent me from ever returning to active duty. I was being medically retired. Just like that. No ceremony. No salute. No thank you for the years I gave them. I begged for more time. I said I could still serve, maybe train new recruits or help with intelligence. But they had already made up their minds. The paperwork was ready. I was discharged with honors, but it didn't feel honorable. It felt like being tossed aside, like I no longer mattered to the system I had sacrificed for. The pain wasn't just physical. It was in my chest, in my heart. I had dedicated my life to the military, to proving that I could be both Arab and American, both Muslim and patriotic. And now, lying in a hospital bed with discharge papers in my hands, I felt like none of it meant anything. I remembered every moment of my training, every brother I had lost, every mission we had survived. I remembered how I had suppressed my fears, how I had told myself that being different wouldn't matter if I just worked hard enough. But in that moment, it did matter. I wasn't blind. I knew I wasn't treated like some of the others. I had felt the sideways glances when I prayed quietly before meals. I had seen the skepticism in the eyes of officers when I mentioned my Lebanese background. Now, with my body broken, I realized they were quicker to let me go. The ride back home was the longest flight of my life. I stared out the window the entire time, trying to fight the lump in my throat. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to feel. But I did. I cried like a child when I reached my apartment in Dearborn, Michigan. My mother tried to comfort me. My father sat quietly, unsure of what to say. I'd come home alive, but I was not the same man. The city felt different, like it no longer had a place for me. I wandered the streets alone sometimes, wearing my sealed jacket, hoping someone would recognize me and say, "Thank you." But no one did. I was invisible again. Just another Arab man walking alone. The loneliness was louder than any explosion I had survived. Over time, I began to turn my hurt inward. I stopped going to the VA. I stopped answering calls from my old teammates. I didn't want to talk about what happened. I didn't want to relive the betrayal. But the pain had to go somewhere, and it turned into anger. I told myself it wasn't just bad luck. It was prejudice. I started to believe that they had never really wanted me there. That they had used me for their image and discarded me when I became inconvenient. I began to think maybe I was a fool forever trusting the system. I had tried so hard to be accepted, to serve a flag that now felt foreign to me. I asked Allah why I had gone through all of this only to be left broken and alone. I didn't find any answers, only silence. The bitterness didn't come all at once. It built slowly. I watched the news and saw how the government praised certain soldiers while ignoring others. I saw documentaries about veterans being honored, their families being celebrated. No one came to my door. No one asked how I was doing. I was left with painkillers, a walking stick, and memories that wouldn't leave me alone. And in that silence, something dark began to take root. I started to question everything, not just the military but the country itself. Was I ever really American? Or had I just been pretending? I had fought for a nation that now pretended I didn't exist. The more I thought about it, the more I felt betrayed. I wasn't angry at ordinary Americans. I was angry at the system that chewed me up and spat me out. At first, I kept my thoughts to myself. I still went to the mosque occasionally, mostly for Friday prayers. I didn't talk much. People greeted me with respect, knowing I had served. But inside I was changing. My prayers were becoming filled with frustration. I stopped asking for peace and started asking for justice. I looked at my scars and thought, this is what they did to me. I didn't see my injuries as the result of war anymore. I saw them as proof that I had been abandoned. I felt like an orphan of two worlds. Not truly American. Not fully Arab anymore. And the more I stayed in that space, the more the anger grew. It was the beginning of something much darker. Something that would eventually lead me down a path I never imagined walking. When I returned home for good, the silence in my head became louder than any battlefield noise I had ever known. I was no longer in uniform, no longer a Navy SEAL, and no longer useful to the system I had given my blood and loyalty to. Every morning, I would sit in my apartment in Dearborn with a cup of coffee I barely touched, staring out of the window while flashes of the ambush in Afghanistan played over and over in my mind. I couldn't sleep well. I jumped at sudden sounds. I avoided crowded places. The VA hospital diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder and gave me a list of support groups and medication. I tried the pills for a while, but they made me numb. The support groups didn't help either. The people there hadn't seen what I'd seen. They hadn't been forgotten the way I had. I stopped going. I stopped caring. Out of desperation, I began going back to the mosque more frequently. The one on Warren Avenue was small, but the faces were familiar. Some of the older men greeted me with warm smiles. They respected that I had served, even if they didn't always understand why. There was comfort in the routine of prayer, the standing, bowing, the recitation of verses I had memorized as a boy in Beirut. But even there, something in me had changed. I was disconnected, watching everything from a distance, not really feeling anything. One evening, after Maghrib prayer, I stayed behind on the carpeted floor, alone and restless. A man I had seen a few times before came and sat beside me. His name was Farid. He was a few years older, quiet, thoughtful, and observant. He asked me how I was doing. At first, I gave the usual answer, "I'm fine." But for some reason that night, I told him the truth. I told Farid about the betrayal, about the discharge, about how I had given everything and received nothing in return. I told him about the nightmares, the loneliness, and the bitterness that now filled my heart. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he placed his hand on my shoulder and said something I still remember word for word. "Sometimes the world pushes us away because Allah has a different path for us, one that is greater than this broken system." I didn't respond. I didn't know what he meant. But in the weeks that followed, Farid kept talking to me after prayers. He would share verses from the Quran, stories about justice, oppression, and the failure of Western governments to protect the dignity of Muslims worldwide. At first, I just listened. It felt good to be heard and understood. He never pressured me. He just made me feel like my pain wasn't mine alone. One night, Farid invited me to a private gathering at a house in Hamtramck. He said it was just a few brothers discussing the state of the Ummah and ways to strengthen our identity as Muslims. I went, unsure of what to expect. The living room was dimly lit. There were 6 men all seated on the floor. They greeted me warmly with phrases like, "Jazakallah khair," and "You are among brothers now." We began with a prayer, then someone played a video on a laptop. It was a sermon, fiery, passionate, and full of talk about Western betrayal, occupation of Muslim lands, and the need for a return to true Islamic justice. I recognized the feeling growing in my chest. It was the same anger I had buried since my discharge. For the first time in months, I felt awake. After the video, the discussion turned to jihad. Not as terrorism, they insisted, but as resistance, as duty, as truth. At first, I pushed back. I had seen bombs tear children apart. I had watched people cry over broken bodies. I told them jihad wasn't the answer. They didn't argue. They asked me to listen, to read, to consider. They showed me scholarly articles, videos, and encrypted messages from others around the world who felt the same pain I did. They introduced me to a dark web platform used by Muslims across the globe, especially in Iran, where more intense discussions took place about the concept of martyrdom, the reward of paradise, and the moral failure of Muslim leaders who denounced jihad. At night, I would scroll through these forums for hours. They were filled with fiery language, images, and testimonies of men who claimed to have found purpose through sacrifice. They quoted verses, many out of context, and twisted religious concepts into weapons. The more I read, the more my heart grew heavy with rage. The people on these forums knew how to speak to broken men. They didn't care about race, nationality, or background. They cared about pain. And they promised that pain had meaning. They said the reason I suffered was because I had tried to serve the enemy. They told me that real honor was not found in a uniform made by infidels, but in the struggle for Allah's cause. They praised my military background, calling it a divine gift. Allah trained you through them, one message read. Now use what they taught you against them. At first, I was uncomfortable. I logged off several times. But every time I felt empty, I returned. The videos were gripping. The articles were convincing. And the voices in the chat rooms were always there, always waiting, always willing to remind me that I had been betrayed, not just by a government, but by a system that hated Muslims like me. The grooming was subtle but effective. They didn't rush me. They gave me reading assignments, linked books in PDF format, some ancient, some modern, about Islamic resistance, colonialism, and the legacy of betrayal in the Muslim world. I was encouraged to fast more, to isolate myself, to pray longer at night. They called it cleansing the self. But in reality, it was a strategy to detach me from my old world and prepare me for something else. They kept repeating that jihad wasn't about death, but about life, about restoring dignity, protecting honor, and fighting against evil. Slowly, I began to believe it. The teachings filled the gap that had been left by my discharge. They gave me a new identity, one rooted not in being American or Arab, but in being a warrior for truth. I stopped questioning. I started following. What once made me hesitate now made me feel chosen. One night, I was added to a private group chat with members from Iran, Syria, and parts of Europe. These men were seasoned. Some were former soldiers like me. Others were scholars. At least that's how they introduced themselves. They spoke of secret meetings, training camps, and operations carried out in silence. They celebrated attacks against those they called traitors, Muslim scholars and imams who had publicly condemned jihad and aligned with Western governments. They shared lists of such scholars, videos of their speeches, and called them hypocrites. It disturbed me at first, but the anger I had toward my own government was now starting to project outward, toward everyone who defended it. These men offered a narrative that made sense of my pain. They said the imams preaching peace were selling Islam for dollars, that they were puppets. I started to believe that too. I felt like I was finally seeing the truth, and it was bitter. The more I listened, the more I changed. My prayers became more intense. My thoughts darker. I stopped watching TV. I cut off contact with former friends. My parents noticed something was wrong, but I told them I was just focusing on religion. I grew a beard, started dressing differently, and avoided conversations that might shake my new mindset. I no longer saw myself as a victim. I saw myself as a soldier, reborn. They told me that the pain I felt wasn't a curse, but a calling. That Allah had preserved me from death in Afghanistan for a reason. That martyrdom wasn't about hate. It was about justice. About standing up when no one else would. I was broken, but now I had a mission. I didn't know exactly where it would lead me, but I was willing to follow. The rage I carried had become my compass, and I was ready to obey it. The deeper I went into the network, the more my view of the world changed. My anger, once focused only on the US military and government, began to turn toward Muslims I once respected, those who preached peace, unity, and coexistence. I started to see them not as brothers but as traitors. In the forums, their names were mentioned often. Famous imams in California, New York, and Illinois were being called out for working with government agencies, holding interfaith events, and speaking against jihad. The videos showed them shaking hands with Christians and Jews, sitting in conferences condemning violence, and promoting a version of Islam that felt weak to us. The network I was in didn't just dislike them, they despised them. We believed they were watering down the religion, making it acceptable to the enemies of Allah, and confusing the younger generation of Muslims in America. During one of the encrypted calls with the group leaders, the topic of fatwas came up. They were furious about the growing number of Islamic scholars around the world issuing legal rulings that labeled jihadist violence as un-Islamic. A scholar from Morocco had just issued a public statement calling for Muslims to resist extremist ideologies. Another well-known Egyptian imam had said martyrdom attacks were sinful. Even some Shia scholars in Iran were beginning to speak out against suicide missions. These declarations were seen by our group as betrayal. One brother shouted through the call, "These scholars are selling their deen for dollars. They wear robes but speak the language of kafir." The group agreed. They said these imams were blocking the way of Allah, twisting the religion to protect the West, and making it harder for fighters to recruit new members. I didn't question it. I had been convinced that our path was the only pure one left. Soon the focus of the group shifted from theory to action. One of the senior voices in the chat room shared a file containing details of an upcoming Muslim peace conference scheduled to take place in Houston, Texas during Ramadan. The event was meant to gather well-known Muslim scholars from across the U.S. to promote peace-building, nonviolence, education, and interfaith cooperation. Some of the very same Imams we had been discussing were listed as keynote speakers. The conference also received support from several Muslim-led NGOs and charities that had partnered with federal agencies for community outreach. These organizations promoted peace, built schools, supported interfaith programs, and gave public lectures warning young Muslims against joining extremist groups. Our leaders called the event a gathering of hypocrites. The discussion quickly turned dark. There was talk of sending a message, not just to the scholars but to all Muslims who had betrayed the cause. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing. I kept looking at the document with the conference schedule. I had never been to Houston before, but it didn't matter. I had the skills. I had the experience. And deep inside, I was tired of just talking. I had lost everything. My career, my peace, my identity. What was left? The thought of striking back against the very people who stood in the way of what I now believed to be the truth began to feel like a final purpose. During the next group meeting, I spoke up. "I'll do it," I said calmly. "Let me be the one." For a moment, the line was silent. Then came the words, "May Allah reward you." They knew I had the training. They knew I wouldn't hesitate. And I knew what I was stepping into. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready to die for what I believed in. After that call, I began preparing in secret. I avoided local contacts and bought all the materials in small batches to avoid suspicion. I used my military knowledge to construct a plan that was both efficient and deadly. I rented a small storage unit just outside of Detroit to store the materials and began assembling the bomb with careful precision. I chose a combination of pressure triggers and remote detonation options, in case the situation changed. I mapped out the layout of the Houston Convention Center where the conference would take place. I downloaded floor plans and studied the entrances, exits, and security measures. I planned to arrive 2 days before the event, posing as a volunteer or delivery worker. The goal was to plant the device in an area where the most influential imams would gather, ideally near the main stage or speaker lounge. As I worked, I felt nothing. No fear. No sadness. Just focus. My heart was cold. I no longer saw people in human terms. I saw targets. I told myself they had chosen this fate by standing against the path of Allah. Every wire I twisted, every component I tightened felt like an act of justice. I didn't care about being caught. I expected to die. I believed my death would be a message, a final strike from a forgotten soldier. And if I survived long enough to be arrested, I told myself I would speak boldly in court, declare my mission, and embrace execution as a martyr's reward. I didn't want to live in a world where liars stood on stage in the name of Islam and called truth extremism. I wanted the world to shake, to remember that one man had stood up when everyone else bowed down. In my apartment, the windows stayed shut. The lights stayed dim. I barely ate. I fasted more. I prayed long hours, repeating verses I thought justified my mission. In reality, I was brainwashed. But I didn't see it that way. I believed I was purified. I believed Allah had preserved me through war, through injury, through rejection, just for this moment. The idea of killing didn't disturb me anymore. Not because I was heartless, but because I had convinced myself that it wasn't murder. I told myself it was cleansing. That removing corrupt leaders was a step towards saving the deen for future generations. And when I imagined the explosion, the chaos, the screams, I didn't feel guilt. I felt peace. I saw it as the end of my pain and the beginning of my reward. My soul was slipping further into the abyss and I didn't even know it. As the day drew closer, I booked a bus ticket under a false name and packed only what I needed. The bomb would be hidden in a small container disguised as technical equipment. I rehearsed my entry and escape routes over and over. I checked the weather in Houston, studied the Ramadan schedule, and noted the time for Friday prayers, when the crowd would be largest. Every detail mattered. I sent a final message to the network confirming the plan. They responded with dua, blessings, and phrases of victory. No one tried to stop me. No one asked if I was okay. In their eyes, I was already gone. I wrote a short letter to my parents and left it in a drawer. I didn't say goodbye. I just thanked them for everything and asked Allah to forgive me. I believed this was the final step in a long, painful journey that had brought me to my purpose. 3 days before the planned attack, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the bomb components spread across the table. I had run the final tests. Everything was ready. There was nothing more to build. No more plans to make. The only thing left was to board that bus and complete the mission. I stared at the timer, the wires, the detonator. I thought about the blood that would be spilled. I thought about the screams. And still I felt calm. There was no fear, no hesitation. I had become something else. A tool in the hands of an ideology that had erased my empathy. I was no longer thinking like a human being. I was thinking like a weapon. And in that cold, quiet moment, I believed I was ready to be used. It was 3 days before I was supposed to board the bus to Houston. My apartment was dark and quiet, just the way I liked it in those days. The blinds were closed, the TV was off, and the floor was cluttered with wires, papers, and small tools from my bomb assembly. I had just finished checking the detonator one last time and placed it back in the storage case when I heard a soft knock on my front door. I froze. No one ever knocked on my door. I wasn't the kind of man people visited. My neighbors rarely spoke to me, and I made sure it stayed that way. My heart raced for a moment. Was it someone from the network? Had they sent someone early? I waited in silence. The knock came again, gentle, patient. Slowly, I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw a young woman standing there holding a small tray. I opened the door just slightly, enough to peek through. She smiled, a real smile, not forced or polite, but warm and unafraid. "Hi," she said. "I live across the hall. I hope this isn't strange, but I just felt like I should bring you something." She handed me the tray. It had a plate of cookies, a small bottle of orange juice, and 3 books stacked neatly on the side. "I baked these last night," she added. "I also included a few books I really love. No pressure to read them, I just felt led to give them to you." I stood there speechless. She didn't look nervous. She didn't seem to know who I was or care what kind of man I might be. I didn't know what to say. Finally, I mumbled, "Thank you," and took the tray. She smiled again and said, "Have a good day," then walked back to her door and disappeared inside. I carried the tray to the table where my bomb pieces had been just moments before. I quickly cleared the wires aside and placed the tray down. For a while, I just stared at it. Something about the moment felt strange, almost out of place. In the middle of all my planning, my darkness, and my silence, this woman had just shown up with cookies and books. I wasn't used to kindness, especially not from Christians, especially not from someone who had no reason to care. I picked up one of the cookies and took a bite. It was soft, warm, sweet. Then I looked at the books. One had a plain black cover. Another was a pocket Bible. But the third one caught my eye. It was thicker than the others, with a photo of an old man on the cover and the title, "Just As I Am, the Autobiography of Billy Graham." I had heard of Billy Graham before. His name had come up in a few conversations growing up, especially when people in the mosque warned us about American televangelists. I had never read anything by him. I didn't even know what he believed. I opened the book and flipped through a few pages. His tone was calm, humble, reflective. He talked about growing up in North Carolina, preaching across the world, meeting people from all walks of life. It wasn't what I expected. There was no hatred, no manipulation, no hidden message. It was just a man telling his story, his journey with God, his failures, his doubts, his calling. I closed the book and pushed it aside, but something inside me felt unsettled. I didn't know why, but I wasn't ready to walk away from it. I looked back at it. Something about that title kept echoing in my head, "Just As I Am." Later that night, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The bomb was already packed away. The storage case was closed. My bag was ready. But instead of rehearsing my plan, I found myself flipping through the pages of the autobiography again. I read slowly at first, then faster. Graham's words felt different from anything I had read before. He didn't try to sell a religion. He didn't attack others. He spoke of grace, of being forgiven, of coming to God not after cleaning yourself up, but while still broken. He wrote about how Jesus had welcomed sinners, criminals, outcasts, people who didn't deserve mercy but received it anyway. I paused. I looked down at my hands. My fingers were scarred from war, from building a weapon meant to destroy. I wasn't a religious Christian, but I wasn't blind. These words were pulling something inside me loose, something I thought was dead. The confusion started slowly. Questions I had buried under rage began to surface. What if this man was right? What if God wasn't waiting for perfect people, but reaching out to the broken? What if everything I had been taught about strength being found only in violence was wrong? I turned another page and found a line that made me stop cold. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. I read it again. The words haunted me. The ground is level. No soldiers. No scholars. No martyrs. Just people equal in need, equal in guilt, and equal in God's eyes. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. Exhausted, really. Like I had been carrying a weight I didn't know how to set down. And somehow this book, this stranger, was helping me see the weight for what it was. The next morning, I woke up with the same confusion. I reached for my phone to check updates from the group but hesitated. Instead, I picked up the second book, a small Bible. I opened to a random page in the New Testament and landed in the Gospel of John. I began to read slowly. Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. I kept reading. Every sentence felt like it was written just for me. Jesus spoke about peace not as the world gives, but a peace that could live inside a person even in the middle of pain. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew something had shifted. I wasn't thinking about the bomb anymore. I wasn't thinking about the Imams or the conference or martyrdom. I was thinking about my own soul. About who I had become. And for the first time, I started to wonder if I was wrong. I went back to Billy Graham's book and searched for more. I found a passage where he described moments of doubt, times when he questioned his purpose, his beliefs, and even God. He didn't hide his struggle. He didn't pretend to be perfect. He simply shared how, over time, faith became more real through surrender, not control. I saw myself in those pages. Not as a preacher. Not as a hero. But as a man who had lost his way and didn't know how to come home. I didn't cry. I couldn't. But something inside me was breaking, quietly, deeply. I thought about the neighbor again. Her smile. Her boldness. What made her knock on my door? Why that day? Why me? She had no idea what I was about to do. Or maybe she did in some way I couldn't understand. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was God reaching out through her hands. By the end of that day, I had stopped communicating with the network. I didn't open the forum. I didn't reply to the coded messages. I sat on the floor with the books, surrounded by words that felt alive. I began to pray not like I used to, not out of ritual or rage, but from a place of broken honesty. God, I said, if this is you, if what I'm reading is true, then stop me. Show me something. Tell me who you are. There was no voice, no vision. Just silence. But it was a different kind of silence this time, not empty but full. Full of possibility. Full of hope. The anger in me didn't disappear, but it softened. The cold resolve began to melt. And in its place was a question I couldn't ignore anymore. What if Jesus is real? That night, after spending hours flipping back and forth through Just As I Am, I knew I wasn't going to sleep. Something inside me had been opened and I couldn't close it again. I kept reading Billy Graham's words like they were water for a man lost in the desert. His stories, his humility, his honesty, it all touched something deep inside me. I read how he doubted, how he sought truth above tradition, and how Jesus changed his life from the inside out. It wasn't just a book anymore. It was a mirror. Every time I read about someone finding hope in Jesus, I saw my own reflection, bitter, broken, and confused. At one point, I paused, closed the book, and whispered, "Who are you, Jesus? And why do I feel this way?" The room was silent, but my heart was loud. Something was happening and I wasn't in control. The urge to know more overwhelmed me. I reached for my phone and searched online for more Billy Graham sermons. I found some PDF files, his old crusade messages, short devotionals, interviews, and Bible study guides. I downloaded everything I could find and began reading one after the other. Each message talked about grace, sin, redemption, and the power of the cross. But what hit me hardest was the repeated phrase, "Come just as you are." Not after cleaning up your life. Not after fixing your past. Just come. As I read his sermons, I realized that the Christianity Billy Graham preached wasn't about politics or control. It was about surrender, about a savior who took on the punishment meant for others. That idea, that someone would die in my place, not for what I had done right but for what I had done wrong, broke through my defenses. I had never known that kind of love before. At around 3 a.m., I quietly reached for the Bible my neighbor had included in the tray. It was small, navy blue, and smelled new. I opened to the Gospel of John again. I had no idea where to start, so I just let my fingers turn the pages. I stopped at John 14 and began to read, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." I stared at the words for a long time. Jesus wasn't claiming to be a prophet. He was claiming to be the way. Not a way. The way. It challenged everything I had believed. I kept reading, feeling like a man stepping onto a path he didn't fully understand. The more I read, the more the words seemed to come alive. I wasn't just reading a book. I felt like the book was reading me, exposing the pain and darkness I had buried. I didn't sleep at all that night. I paced the floor, reading one passage after another, flipping between Billy Graham's autobiography and the Bible. I read about the woman caught in adultery whom Jesus forgave, about the thief on the cross who found paradise in his last breath, about Saul the persecutor becoming Paul the preacher. Each story pulled me deeper into conviction. I had planned to kill. I had constructed a bomb meant to destroy. And here was a man, Jesus, who forgave those who nailed him to the cross. I was terrified. Not because I feared punishment, but because I finally saw myself for who I really was. Not a soldier. Not a martyr. Not a victim. A sinner. A man so twisted by pain and anger that he was willing to end lives in the name of something he didn't fully understand. And yet, in the middle of that guilt, I felt hope. As the sun began to rise, I sat down on the floor, overwhelmed. My legs were shaking. My heart raced. I didn't know how to pray as a Christian, but I spoke honestly. I whispered, "Jesus, I don't know what this is. I don't know if you're real. But if you are who this book says you are, I want to know you. I want to know truth." I waited, not knowing what would happen. There was no flash of light, no voice from the sky. Just stillness and peace. A peace I hadn't felt in years. I sat there crying silently for the first time since I came back from war. Not because I was weak, but because I finally felt seen. I felt like God wasn't far anymore. He was near. Not condemning, but welcoming. That moment changed everything. I didn't have all the answers, but I had found the door, and I wanted to walk through it. By midday, I made the hardest decision of my life. I would not go to Houston. I would not carry out the attack. I carefully opened the storage case and began disassembling the bomb piece by piece. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from realization. Everything I had worked on for weeks, everything I had believed was righteous vengeance, was now poison in my hands. I dismantled the device slowly and packed the materials into different boxes. I would find a way to dispose of them safely. I no longer cared what the network thought. I didn't check their messages. I didn't respond. For the first time, I felt free. But I also knew the danger. If they found out I had backed out, they would assume the worst. They would think I was a spy. They might come after me. I didn't care. I would rather die clean than live as a killer. That evening, I opened the Bible again and read from Romans. The words struck me like lightning. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I couldn't believe how deeply it touched me. I had never read anything like it in the Quran or any other book. It wasn't just knowledge, it was mercy. Mercy that didn't wait for me to be worthy. It met me at my lowest. I got down on my knees, closed my eyes, and prayed again. This time I didn't whisper. I said it clearly, softly, but firmly. Jesus, I believe in you. I don't understand everything, but I believe. I want to follow you. I surrender. The words came out like water from a broken dam. I knew I was crossing a line that would change my life forever. But I didn't feel fear. I felt reborn. As if the weight of all my guilt had been lifted off my shoulders. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I kept everything hidden. My neighbor still didn't know what had happened. The books were still on the table. The Bible was under my pillow. I stopped going to the mosque. I deleted the group chats. I even got rid of the VPN I had used to access the dark forums. I became invisible, not to hide from the world, but to protect what had just begun growing inside of me. My faith was like a newborn. It needed silence, space, and care. I walked around my neighborhood quietly, noticing things I had ignored for years. The sound of birds, the warmth of the sun, the smell of trees in bloom. I wasn't the same man anymore. I was still Jaroudi, still Arab, still scarred by war. But now I was something more. I was a believer in Christ, and though I couldn't speak it publicly yet, I knew it was real. As the days passed, I began searching for more. I watched YouTube sermons from other Christian teachers. I downloaded Bible apps. I listened to worship songs with the volume turned low. Everything was new, and yet everything felt familiar, like a home I had never known but had always longed for. I kept reading Billy Graham's testimony, studying every line. He talked about the cost of following Jesus, about criticism, about suffering, about how true faith grows in the dark. I understood that now. I was living it. I had traded a life of rage for a life of grace. I had let go of revenge and found peace. The cross was no longer a symbol of another religion. It was my rescue, my anchor, my hope. I didn't know where this road would lead, but for the first time I didn't need to know. I only knew that I had met the one who called me out of darkness and into light. The day after I gave my life to Jesus, I received a message from one of the brothers in the network. It was short. "Are you ready for the mission?" My hands trembled. I knew what that message really meant. They were watching. They were expecting confirmation. If I ignored it, suspicion would rise. If I responded with anything less than certainty, I could be labeled a traitor. For a moment, I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the screen. Then I deleted the message. No reply. No explanation. I powered off the phone, removed the SIM card, and threw it down the garbage chute in my apartment building. That was the moment I knew I had to run. Not just from the bombing plan, not just from the group, but from everything. These men were not just talkers. They had reach. They knew how to find people. I was no longer one of them. I was now a target. I packed what little I could carry, a few clothes, some cash I had saved, my passport, and the Bible I had been reading every night. I left everything else behind, including the tools and materials for the bomb, which I had already disassembled and broken into parts. I dropped them into dumpsters around the city, miles apart, making sure nothing could be traced. My heart pounded as I boarded a bus to Chicago, then another to New York. Every moment felt like someone might be following me. I didn't speak to anyone. I kept my head down, eyes low. From JFK Airport, I booked the earliest available flight to Beirut, paying in cash through a third-party service. As I sat in the terminal waiting to board, I prayed under my breath, not as a Muslim, but as a new follower of Christ, asking God to protect me. I didn't know what would happen next, but I trusted Him more than I feared them. When I landed in Beirut, the air smelled familiar, dusty, dry, and warm. It had been nearly 2 decades since I'd walked those streets. I didn't contact any family. I couldn't risk exposing them. I traveled south to a small Christian village near Jezin, a place I had heard about through an online Christian community. I had never visited before, but it felt safer than staying in the capital. A retired Maronite priest there allowed me to rent a modest guest house beside the church in exchange for helping with repairs. The people didn't ask many questions. They saw my limp, my silence, and gave me space. I kept my identity hidden. I told them only what was necessary, that I was recovering from war and searching for peace. Every night, I read the Bible by candlelight. Every morning, I thanked Jesus for a new day. My soul was healing, but danger still lingered in the shadows. It didn't take long before the threats began. Somehow, someone from the network discovered that I had fled the US. They didn't know where I was exactly, but they knew I had disappeared without explanation. One message reached me through an old encrypted account I had forgotten to delete. It said, "We know you ran. You betrayed your brothers and turned your back on Allah. We'll find you. You're not safe anywhere." My blood turned cold. I immediately shut down every digital connection I had used before and destroyed the devices. I changed my name, got rid of all identification linked to my past, and relied only on cash. I never walked the same road twice in a week. I wore simple clothes and avoided cameras. I lived like a fugitive, not because of the law, but because of the ideology I had once embraced. They had trained me to hunt. Now I knew how they would come. Despite the fear, life in the village brought a kind of peace I had never known before. The people were gentle, kind, and humble. They didn't treat me like a foreigner or a stranger. They treated me like a soul in need of healing. One day, while helping fix the roof of a neighbor's home, I met Miriam. She was quiet, strong, and deeply rooted in her faith. She didn't ask about my past. She simply offered tea and told me about her small Bible study group. Over time, we spoke more. We walked together after evening services. We read scripture under the olive trees. I told her the truth eventually, not all the details, but enough for her to understand what I had walked away from. She didn't run. She didn't judge. She prayed with me. Months later, we were married in a simple ceremony with only a few witnesses. A year after that, our daughter was born. We named her Grace. Becoming a husband and father changed something deep inside me. I no longer thought of myself as a man trying to escape death. I began to see myself as someone chosen to protect life, especially the new life that had come into our home. Holding Grace in my arms was a moment I will never forget. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, her breath soft and warm against my chest. I thought about the lives I almost destroyed. I thought about how close I came to becoming the very thing I once claimed to hate. And then I looked at her face and knew God had given me a second chance, not just to live, but to love. I vowed to raise her in truth, not hatred, in mercy, not fear. I vowed to be a man who built rather than destroyed, a man who followed the teachings of Jesus no matter the cost. In time, I began to share my story with others, but always in secret. I found a small network of underground Christian converts, some former Muslims, others simply wounded souls looking for light. We met in quiet homes, away from attention. We read the Bible together, prayed, and encouraged each other to hold on to faith. I never used my real name. I changed locations often, never staying too long in one place. But I knew I had to speak. I had to let others know that there was a way out. That Jesus wasn't just for the West. He wasn't the enemy. He was the savior of all who seek him. Slowly, I became a preacher, not from a pulpit, but from a place of brokenness. My sermons were simple. I didn't have theological training, but I had a story. And in that story was proof that Jesus still saves, still transforms, still reaches into the darkest corners to rescue the lost. Every time I shared my testimony, I could see the eyes of the listeners widen with disbelief. Many had never heard of a former Navy SEAL, a former jihadist, now standing in front of them with a Bible in hand. Some wept. Some questioned. Some left afraid. But others stayed. Others returned. Others believed. I didn't force anything. I simply told them what happened to me. How I once built a bomb to destroy Imams but was stopped by a plate of cookies and a book about grace. How I met Jesus not in a church, but in a quiet apartment surrounded by silence and guilt. And how he changed everything. Some nights, I lay awake wondering if the men from the network still searched for me. I knew they probably did. But fear no longer controlled me. If I died for preaching the gospel, so be it. I had already been given the greatest gift, a new heart. To my Muslim brothers and sisters, I have one thing to say: don't fear the Bible. Read it. Ask Allah for truth. That's what I did. I wasn't brainwashed by Christians. I wasn't tricked by the West. I simply opened a book. I asked God to show me what was real. And he did. I read the Quran all my life, but it never gave me peace. It gave me rules, identity, pride, but not peace. The Bible gave me Jesus. It gave me love, forgiveness, and hope. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to convert. But at least read it. At least ask the question. What if Jesus is more than a prophet? What if he really is the Son of God? Don't reject it because of what you've been told. Ask with sincerity. Ask with humility. And if you do, I believe you'll find what I found, not a religion, but a savior. To my fellow Christians, my story should have ended in blood. It should have ended in fire, chaos, and death. I was moments away from carrying out a mission that would have claimed the lives of peaceful men, Muslim scholars, imams, community leaders, People who had nothing to do with the war inside me. And I would have done it. I had the training. I had the means. I had the will. But what stopped me wasn't an argument. It wasn't a debate. It wasn't even a sermon. It was a plate of cookies and a book.